Well, hello. Today we're going to talk about mushrooms. And I'm Alan Windham. I'm a professor of plant pathology with UT Extension. And I'm going to talk about some of the common mushrooms that you might find in your garden or you might see out on hikes and other places in Tennessee. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. So I titled this Some of the Mushrooms of Tennessee because we can't cover all of them. There are a lot of different types of higher fungi in Tennessee, and we're going to discuss some of the more common ones. The first group we're going to talk about are the guild mushrooms, and there's a wide variety in this group. But as you can see from this indigo cap, one of the more beautiful mushrooms, that it does have gills under the cap from which spores will fall and be dispersed. There are a lot of different types of fungi or mushrooms in this group. One of the more common types of mushrooms in this group is the russulas, and a common one is the red russulas. Um, they are very common under hardwood trees and sometimes under pine trees. They are mycorrhizal, meaning that they form an association with the roots of those trees, which is beneficial. So often when you see these, definitely a good sign because they do benefit the trees that help it absorb water when it's a little bit dry. And in some soils, if phosphorus is low, they can help the tree absorb phosphorus that otherwise wouldn't be available. Now, one of the fun mushrooms that we're sometimes asked about is the yellow parasol or the yellow houseplant mushroom, and it often shows up in pots of woody plants or flowers. It loves growing in high organic matter soils. Occasionally, you might see it in a landscape bed, but it's harmless. The only thing that it might do, it might cause the soil to be a little hydrophobic and repel water, but that doesn't often happen. It's not a pathogen, so it's not hurting the plant, but it is one that we do see occasionally. The other thing that you'll see that guild mushrooms sometimes do, sometimes they'll form fairy rings, and that's, we call a fairy ring basically a circle of mushrooms. Sometimes they appear overnight. A lot of different type of fungi that we associate with fairy rings. But the guild mushrooms are really common. This is the meadow mushroom that we see here. But another big one is the green gill parasol, big white mushroom that's common in lawns, roadsides, pastures in late summer and into the fall. Sometimes they do cause some dead rings around the fairy ring, but often it's just a little bit greener than the rest of the grass, or in this, like in this case, really can't tell that it does anything. Not all the guild mushrooms are beneficial. There are some. This is an armillaria that you often see in groups in late summer or in the fall near the base of trees. It can be a pathogen of woody plants. Sometimes if you're out hiking in the woods, you might see a log that has these black shoestrings running down the trunk. Well, those are really just bands or cords of mycelium or hyphae that the mushroom has produced, and it helps it to move long distances, up to 30 feet from one infected tree to another, or even just down a log as it's decaying it. Another interesting mushroom is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which is common in late summer or in the fall. It's a bright orange guild mushroom, sometimes found around trees. It can cause wood decay. It's not a plant pathogen. Probably one of the more interesting aspects of this mushroom is that it fluoresces. This is an image from a friend of mine, Dr. Dave Clement, University of Maryland, where he collected the mushroom, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, took it into a dark room, and then took this photograph of it fluorescing. You may have heard this called foxfire or other terms, but there are several mushrooms that will fluoresce at night in darkness, so it's not that uncommon. You may have seen this mushroom featured on a moving van, and that's it's an armillaria also, armillaria mushroom. And its claim to fame is that it's called the humongous uh, mushroom, not because the mushroom itself is huge size, but because this mushroom, by mycelium spreading, uh, it has grown for hundreds, if not thousands of years and can cover like 2,500 acres in the western US, or even in Michigan, there was one that covered 37 acres. So just unbelievable that they could spread this far, cover that much area, and be one mushroom. Well, let's move on to another type. We'll leave the guild mushrooms and go to a type that produces pores underneath the caps, not gills. And we call those boletes if they look like mushrooms but have the pores underneath, or we call them polypores if there's some of the fungi that we see on trees or at the base of stumps. Here to the right here, we have a type of bolete with the pore type on the underside of the cap, and to the left, we've got one of the sulfur shelf mushrooms. A really common polypore is the dryad saddle. Dryad meaning wood elf, and it kind of looks like a saddle if you use your imagination. But it's very common on decaying logs, or sometimes you might even see one growing from a wound where a branch was removed from a tree. They do decay the wood, but they're not considered plant pathogens, so they're just part of the natural cycle of recycling nutrients from wood and making it available to other organisms. A brightly colored polypore that's fairly common in Tennessee is the sulfur shelf mushroom. This is one that I saw here in Nashville back in the fall, and it's very colorful and very common on hardwood trees. It does, not a plant pathogen again, but yes, it does cause wood decay. Another polypore, this is fairly common too. This is the artist conch mushroom, again, a dermis species. And it's commonly found on stumps or trees with some decay. Its claim to fame is it produces a lot of spores. And if I just have a little quiz over here, if you were going to guess how many spores one of these conchs on this tree could cause, what do you think? How many per second could it produce? 350, 3,500, 35,000, or 350,000 spores per second? It's actually 350,000 spores per second. And it can do that 6 months of the year for 10 years. That's a lot of spores. That's about 5 trillion spores per year produced by one conch. So it produces a lot of spores. Now, there are some fungi that don't have gills and they don't have pores, but they just produce their spores on like teeth, or we call them tooth fungi. And one of the more common are the lion's mane fungi, and there are a couple different types that we might see in Tennessee. These are often found on standing trees that have some decay, and they look white and they look hairy, but it's actually teeth-like structures that are producing the spores. There are a couple of common types in Tennessee. This is the lion's mane to the left, and this is another species to the right that I photographed in the Smokies. But they're really fascinating fungi because they do decay wood, but they're not plant pathogens. So let's move to the club fungi, and this is just kind of a group that I've thrown together to include several types of fungi. And one of the more common are the stinkhorn fungi that you might see in a landscape bed or out in the woods, anywhere that there's bark or lots of organic matter. The stinkhorn fungi are often smelt before you see them, because that smell helps to attract insects. And when insects land on the brown sticky spore producing region of the stinkhorn, they will be covered in spores, and then when they fly away, they'll help disperse the spores. So There are a couple types that we see in Tennessee. This is the elegant stinkhorn. The second one is called the lantern stinkhorn. Same thing, smells, produces spores at its tip. It attracts insects and they help disperse the spores. Well, not all stinkhorns are club shaped. Some are more lattice like. This is the columnar stinkhorn that has like 3 columns that fuse at the top. Works the same way though. It does smell and it does produce spores in a sticky region, which insects help produce. So I call these garden oddities. If you have them in your garden, they're not harmful. They're just growing in the organic matter. You can remove them if you'd like to with a shovel, but otherwise they're not causing any harm. The coral fungi we sometimes see in wooded areas, actually sometimes in a lawn. They produce spores on these coral type growths. They're not uncommon, but they're often overlooked because they're so well camouflaged, except for the violet coral fungus that this photo Jason Reeves, the horticulturist in Jackson, sent to me from a West Tennessee lawn. So they're beautiful in their structure and sometimes in their color, but they're just growing again on organic matter and they're not a plant pathogen. Some of the crust fungi are flattened. They really don't have produced mushrooms or conchs or anything like that. They just grow often on decaying wood. This is one of the more beautiful crust fungi. This is the cobalt crust fungus, not uncommon in Tennessee, often overlooked because it grows on the underside of branches on the ground or logs on the ground, and you have to roll those over to often see this. But not a plant pathogen, just helping to recycle nutrients in decaying logs. The puffballs are interesting because in this case, all the spores are enclosed within these different shaped puffballs. And as they mature, the puffballs will rupture, often releasing the spores in a cloud that almost looks like smoke. This is a really common one found in lawns and along roadsides and pastures. It's about the size of a small loaf of bread. It's the bird nest puffball. Another type puffball that's really common is one called Lycoperdon. It's often found in clusters on decaying logs, and it's very interesting to show to your children and grandchildren because as raindrops hit these, they will release spores in a little puff. Another puffball that I've seen is the earth stars. These are really beautiful. I've seen these in landscape beds where I've used hardwood mulch. And this is a different type puffball, but just growing in organic matter. Again, the puffballs I would call a garden oddity. They're not doing any harm, but it's just one of the things that make gardening more interesting. There are a lot of different jelly type mushrooms that will often be more visible after we've had some rain, and you might find these on decaying logs or trees or on branches on the ground. You may have been picking up branches like me after a rain and reach down and grab one that has a jelly fungus growing on it. Feels kind of icky, but they're harmless and they're really interesting. This is one called tree's ear. And as far as cup type fungi, these are called splash cups or bird nest fungi. And I think you can see why, because they do look like little bird's nests on this mulch. And inside they have their spores are inside these egg-like structures. And when water or raindrops enter these cups, the little egg-like structures they come exploding out. And in the case of bird's nest fungi, these little eggs will trail a little white cord of mycelium that will sometimes wrap around a twig or around the pine needles. Or sometimes you might just find them on your tomatoes. But they're just, again, a garden oddity growing on the mulch. And this way of dispersal of the spores through raindrops or through irrigation is a great one, but doesn't cause any harm to your plants or to your vegetables. One that can be kind of a sticky situation is a smaller cup type fungus, and it's the artillery fungus. And it has a projectile that it can forcibly eject going like 16 feet high or 8 feet away. These little cups will actually turn toward light colored objects such as siding or light colored cars and blow these or shoot these projectiles. They're black when they're mature onto the foliage of plants or on the siding of cars, and they can be very difficult to remove, but they're just growing on mulch. If this bothers you, I probably would move away from hardwood mulch and try something else. So one of the really highly prized edible mushrooms that grows in Tennessee are the morels. Several different types. If you know someone that collects morels in the spring, they may have their own patch they go to every year. Most people that know where morels grow are very secretive about where they grow, but they're really interesting. This is one of the sac fungi. It produces spores in little sac-like structures in this lattice work on the stem of these mushrooms. I would say if you can, go with someone that's experienced in collecting morels. Even though they're fairly easy to identify, it's just best to go with an expert the first time or two. And just know that there are lookalikes, even though this doesn't really look too much like a morel. False morels are poisonous. They do sometimes grow in mulch beds. They look like they have distorted caps, but this is one that you would not want to pick. So that's a quick overview of some of the different mushrooms in Tennessee. These are some of my favorite references that I've collected over the years. The first one I collected was mushrooms of West Virginia and the Central Appalachians. It's a really good field guide to the mushrooms with lots of good information and lots of good photos. One of the newer field guides is Mushrooms of the Southeast. Came out a couple of years ago, I think 2018. It's a great field guide. And one of the newer field guides just out, I think in 2020, is a field guide to mushrooms of the Carolinas. These are all very good. I will say that if you're interested in foraging, collecting mushrooms, probably one of the safest ways to do that is to join a mycological society. I think there are a couple here in Tennessee that would be worth joining and going out learning from experts. Otherwise, I probably would not forage just based on using a field guide. It's always best to go out with an expert, learn from the expert on those that are easily safe to collect and those that you want to stay away from. So if you're thinking about foraging, take the effort, take the time to join a local mycological society, go out on some forays, collect with them, and learn from the experts. The other things that you can do if you'd like to grow some of your own mushrooms is there are lots of different mushroom kits online now that you can purchase and grow these in your own home. And they're fairly easy to grow and fairly fast to grow. So you might try that. Sometimes at field days or different things, you'll see people that do grow mushrooms on logs. They will inoculate logs. And sometimes you can buy one of these logs and take it home, put it in a shaded area, keep it moist, and the mushrooms will fruit. And then the last thing is, I have seen at the Nashville Farmers Market, I think most of these are probably grown from kits, but you will sometimes see vendors selling mushrooms. And those that are grown from kits like this are fairly safe to buy and cook. So that's just kind of a brief overview of mushrooms in Tennessee. I'm going to stop the share right there. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. But those references that I mentioned are great references for learning more about mushrooms, for identifying mushrooms, and there are a lot of good resources online too. So thanks for watching this video with me today, and I hope you enjoyed it.